A cold breeze swept through the nearly deserted street as the neon lights flickered in the distance. It was past midnight, and most of the city was asleep, except for those who had nowhere to go. Among them was Daniel, a man whose life had taken a downward spiral in the past year. Once an aspiring entrepreneur, he now barely managed to make ends meet. His clothes were worn, his shoes had seen better days, and his wallet was almost always empty. Daniel sat on a wooden bench at a bus stop, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He had spent the entire day searching for odd jobs, hoping to earn just enough for a warm meal. But luck wasn't on his side. As he sighed, ready to call it another hopeless day, a distant sound caught his attention, a car sputtering and then going completely silent. A sleek black sedan stood motionless a few meters away. Its driver, a well-dressed woman, stepped out, frustration evident on her face. She looked around helplessly, her phone in hand, but no tow trucks or taxis were in sight at this late hour. Daniel hesitated. He was no expert, but he had spent enough time fixing his old car back when he had one. He approached cautiously. "Excuse me, ma'am. Need some help?" The woman turned, surprised. She was in her late 20s, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and success. "My car just died," she said with a sigh. "I was on my way home, but now—" Daniel gave the car a quick glance. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated. He didn't exactly look like a professional mechanic. But with no other options, she nodded. Daniel lifted the hood and inspected the engine. It wasn't a major issue, just a loose battery connection. With a few careful adjustments, he managed to get the car running again. The woman's face lit up with relief. "That was impressive. Thank you." Daniel shrugged. "Just happy to help." She reached into her purse, pulling out a crisp bill. "Here, for your trouble." Daniel shook his head. "No need. Just glad you're safe." The woman studied him for a moment, a curious expression crossing her face. "What's your name?" "Daniel." "Thank you, Daniel. I'm Olivia. I won't forget this." Little did he know, that night's encounter was about to change everything. Daniel watched as Olivia drove away, the glow of her car's taillights disappearing into the distance. He let out a small sigh, running a hand through his messy hair. Another night, another act of kindness that didn't change his reality. His stomach growled in protest, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day. With his hands shoved into his pockets, Daniel walked toward a small alley where he had found temporary shelter. It wasn't much, just a corner behind an old bookstore, shielded from the wind. He pulled out an old blanket from his worn-out backpack, wrapping it around himself. Sleep wouldn't come easy, but exhaustion eventually won. A year ago, Daniel's life had been completely different. He had a stable job at a car repair shop, a decent apartment, and dreams of starting his own business. He wasn't rich, but he had enough to live comfortably. However, life had other plans. One day, the repair shop shut down unexpectedly due to financial problems. Daniel and his colleagues were left jobless overnight. Without savings to fall back on, things unraveled quickly. He struggled to find stable work, picking up temporary jobs here and there, but nothing lasted long enough to keep him afloat. Bills piled up, and soon, his landlord had no choice but to evict him. With no family to turn to, Daniel ended up on the streets. He tried to keep his spirits high, believing things would turn around. But months passed, and hope became harder to hold on to. The world was a cruel place for those without money or status. On the other side of the city, Olivia parked her car in the driveway of a grand mansion. She stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of a luxurious home filled with expensive furniture, artwork, and a staff ready to attend to her every need. But despite having everything money could buy, Olivia felt empty. Born into wealth, Olivia had never struggled a day in her life. She worked as a senior executive at her father's company, but deep down, she questioned if this was the path she truly wanted. Everything had always been handed to her, her education, her job, even the car she drove. As she poured herself a glass of wine, she found her thoughts drifting back to the man who had helped her. There was something about him, his humility, his refusal to take money, that intrigued her. Most people in his situation would have accepted the cash, but he didn't. He had helped her simply because he wanted to. Olivia wasn't used to that. In her world, everything came with a price. That night, she made a decision. She was going to find Daniel again. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the distant hum of the city coming to life. His body ached from another night on the cold pavement, but he was used to it by now. Stretching his sore limbs, he picked up his backpack and started walking toward a nearby park where he could freshen up at the public restrooms. As he splashed cold water on his face, he caught his reflection in the mirror. His beard had grown scruffy, his hair unkempt, and his once bright blue eyes looked tired. He barely recognized himself anymore. Shaking off the thoughts, he stepped outside, ready to face another day of job hunting. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in her office, unable to focus on the endless reports in front of her. She found herself searching online for ways to help homeless individuals, but she knew Daniel wasn't just another statistic. He had pride, dignity, and likely wouldn't accept charity. Determined to find him, she took the rest of the day off. She drove through the streets, scanning sidewalks, parks, and alleys, hoping for a glimpse of him. Hours passed with no luck. Just as she was about to give up, she spotted him near a small community center, speaking to a volunteer. Pulling over, Olivia hesitated for a moment before stepping out of her car. As she approached, Daniel turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "You?" he said, frowning slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I was looking for you," Olivia admitted. Daniel crossed his arms. "Why?" Olivia hesitated. How could she explain that their brief encounter had left an impression on her? That she wanted to help him without making him feel like a charity case? "I wanted to thank you properly," she said instead, "for helping me last night." "I already told you. I don't need thanks," Daniel replied, shifting uncomfortably. "I get that," Olivia said, choosing her words carefully. "But I also know that life hasn't been easy for you. I want to help, but only if you let me." Daniel studied her for a moment before sighing. "Help how?" "There's a job opening at my father's company," Olivia said. "It's not much, but it's stable work. I can get you an interview." Daniel frowned. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." "Because I believe in second chances," Olivia said sincerely. "And I think you deserve one." Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. A part of him wanted to accept. He was tired of struggling, of being treated like he didn't matter. But another part of him, the one that had learned not to trust kindness without a catch, hesitated. "What's the job?" he finally asked. "An entry-level mechanic position," Olivia said. "It's at one of our subsidiary companies. Nothing fancy, but it's a start." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, thinking. "I don't want pity," he said quietly. "This isn't pity," Olivia replied. "It's an opportunity." A long silence stretched between them before Daniel finally exhaled. "All right," he said. "I'll do the interview. But if I get the job, I want it to be because of my skills, not because you pulled strings." Olivia smiled. "Fair enough." The next morning, Daniel stood outside the auto repair shop Olivia had mentioned, his nerves on edge. The building was larger than he had expected, with rows of cars lined up for service and the sound of power tools echoing from within. He adjusted his worn-out jacket and took a deep breath before stepping inside. A middle-aged man with a gruff expression and oil-stained hands looked up from under the hood of a car. "Help you with something?" he asked. Daniel swallowed his nerves. "I'm here for the mechanic interview." "Olivia, Ms. Carter told me about the job." The man wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, eyeing Daniel from head to toe. "You're Daniel, huh?" "Yes, sir. I'm Mark. I run this shop," the man said, crossing his arms. "Ms. Carter told me you had experience working on cars." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I worked at a small garage for a couple of years. I know my way around engines, brakes, and transmission systems." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's so? Well, we don't hire just anyone off the street. You up for a test?" Daniel straightened. "Absolutely." Mark led him to a car in the corner of the garage. "This here is a '98 Ford Mustang. The owner says it's making a weird rattling noise. Think you can figure out what's wrong?" Daniel rolled up his sleeves, kneeling by the car. He listened closely as the engine idled, his trained ear picking up the faint rattle from underneath. Sliding under the car, he examined the undercarriage, his fingers brushing against a loose heat shield. He smirked. "It's the heat shield on the exhaust," Daniel said confidently, standing up. "It's loose and vibrating when the engine runs. Probably just needs tightening or replacing." Mark let out a short chuckle. "Not bad. Most newbies take half an hour to figure that out." Daniel shrugged. "I love cars. Always have." Mark gave him a long look before nodding. "All right. You're hired, on a trial basis. 1 week probation. You prove yourself, we'll talk about something more permanent." Relief flooded through Daniel. "Thank you. You won't regret it." Mark grunted. We'll see about that. Get yourself some coveralls and be here at 7 a.m. sharp tomorrow. That evening, Daniel sat on a park bench, staring at the sky. For the first time in years, he had hope. A real job. A chance to rebuild. He could afford to rent a small place if he saved up. Maybe even turn things around completely. Lost in thought, he almost didn't hear the footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Olivia standing there, smiling. "You found me again," Daniel said with a small smirk. "I wanted to see how your interview went," Olivia replied. "So?" Daniel leaned back, exhaling. "I got the job. Probationary for now, but it's something." A genuine smile spread across Olivia's face. "I knew you could do it." Daniel studied her for a moment. "Why do you care so much?" Olivia hesitated before sitting beside him. "Because I know what it's like to feel lost. Maybe not in the same way you have, but I felt stuck before. And sometimes, all we need is one person to believe in us." Daniel looked away, a strange warmth in his chest. "Well, thanks for believing in me." Olivia nudged him playfully. "Don't make me regret it." They shared a small laugh, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the auto repair shop just before 7 a.m. The garage was already buzzing with activity, mechanics moving between cars, the hum of power tools filling the air. He pulled on a pair of coveralls Mark had given him the previous day and stepped inside, ready to prove himself. Mark barely glanced at him before tossing him a clipboard. "You're on oil changes and diagnostics today? Think you can handle that?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I got it." For the first few hours, he worked tirelessly, double-checking everything to ensure he didn't make mistakes. He handled routine maintenance, changing oil, checking brakes, and replacing worn-out filters. His hands were covered in grease, but he didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, he was doing something he was good at. But it wasn't long before his first real test arrived. "Yo, Daniel," one of the senior mechanics, Rick, called out. "We've got a problem with this Chevy. The engine's misfiring, but diagnostics aren't giving a clear answer. Think you can figure it out?" Daniel wiped sweat off his brow and approached the car. He listened carefully as the engine sputtered, then ran his fingers over the ignition coils. Something felt off. "Swap out the ignition coil on cylinder 3, Daniel said after a moment. Rick raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Daniel nodded. "It's not completely dead, but it's failing under load. That's why the misfire is inconsistent." Rick shrugged. "All right, let's see." Half an hour later, the car was running smoothly. Rick let out an impressed whistle. "Not bad, new guy? Maybe you do know your stuff." Mark, who had been watching from the sidelines, finally spoke up. "Keep this up, and you might last here longer than a week." Over the next few days, Daniel worked harder than he ever had. Each morning, he showed up early. Each night, he stayed late. Slowly but surely, he started gaining the respect of his coworkers. Even Mark, who was notoriously tough on new hires, started nodding in approval. Despite his growing confidence, doubts still lingered in his mind. Would this really last? Could he truly turn his life around? Then, on Friday afternoon, Mark called him into the office. "You've been here a week now," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "And I gotta say, you're better than I expected." Daniel held his breath. "You're officially hired. Full-time." Relief washed over him. "Thank you, Mark. I won't let you down." Mark smirked. "You'd better not." As Daniel left the office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "Olivia, meet me at the cafe down the street after work. I have something to tell you." His heart skipped a beat. What could it be? Daniel arrived at the cafe just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The small, cozy shop was quiet, filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Olivia sat near the window, her expression unreadable. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Hey." She smiled and gestured to the seat across from her. "Hey, Daniel. How was work?" "Good. Actually really good," he admitted. "I got hired full-time." Her eyes lit up. "That's amazing. I knew they'd see how talented you are." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, well, I had a little help from someone." He studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. "You said you had something to tell me?" Olivia nodded, hesitating for just a second before pulling out an envelope from her bag. "This is for you." Daniel frowned as he took it. "What is it?" "Open it." He carefully slid the paper out and scanned the contents. His breath hitched. It was a formal job offer from Westwood Motors, a high-end auto dealership. And at the bottom, Olivia's signature. His head shot up. You did this." She nodded. I told you I had connections. My father owns the dealership, and I spoke to him about you. He agreed to give you a shot as a mechanic there. Better pay, better working conditions, and an opportunity to work with top-tier cars. Daniel blinked, completely overwhelmed. Olivia, he shook his head. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just know that I believe in you. For a long moment, Daniel just sat there, staring at the offer. A few weeks ago, he had nothing, no job, no stability, no future. And now, because of one act of kindness, his entire life was turning around. You changed my life, he murmured. Olivia reached for his hand. No, Daniel. You changed your own life. I just gave you a little push. He met her gaze, something warm and new blooming in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more than just a fresh start. And for the first time in years, he truly believed in himself.